around this computer. So I'm Emma Pringle, and I'm with John Kissinger, and it's April 15th at 1:05 p.m. Where would you like to start?
Well, I want to tell you a little bit about my history on the Western Maryland and further railroad experiences as the Western Maryland got merged into other railroads as time went on. In 1970, I was an 18-year-old working in Morgantown, West Virginia for a small sign company. And my grandfather, who was a locomotive engineer in Elkins, sent me an application to work on the railroad. He hired as a fireman in May of 1924, born in Willdale, West Virginia. He was the son of a lumberjack. He came to Elkins to work on the railroad, I think prior to being even 18 years old. My dad worked on the railroad for the B&O for about 3 months in Clarksburg before he got furloughed, and he never went back. He found other work and decided never to go back. In April 1970, my grandfather had sent me this application to get hired as a brakeman on the railroad. I didn't know anything about the railroad other than when I went to visit he and my grandmother. Sometimes he wasn't there, he was out working. And that's about all I knew about the railroad. I really didn't know much. So I wasn't sure I wanted to go to work on the railroad. But in a phone call a week or so after I got the application, a phone call with him, he convinced me that it was the right thing to do. So I did send the application back, and lo and behold, in May 18th of 1970, I got hired as a brakeman along with 3 other gentlemen. There hadn't been anyone hired for several years, so we ended up, I'll say, gaining seniority by virtue of not having anyone hired for probably 6 or 8 years there in Elkins. And I think we were probably close to the last ones that were hired in Elkins because of things that occurred later on with the Western Maryland Railroad, where they discontinued service east of Elkins toward Thomas and took that coal over through Grafton. So we 4 guys were assigned to the extra board at Elkins. That meant being subject to call 24 hours a day for any vacancies that occurred on any jobs that worked in the Elkins area. In 1970, crews were allowed to work 16 hours a day in a shift. Today, it's been moved down to 12 hours through the federal government's demands that time on duty be cut down short, same as what they've done in the trucking industry. At that time in 1970, there were several jobs working out of Elkins, and I'd like to spend a little time telling you about those jobs and how they worked. The East Local, as it was called, went to work 6 days a week out of Elkins, hauling coal and other freight between Elkins and Cumberland, Maryland, that is. It was generally called to go to work about 11 a.m. It had a set of helper locomotives that were in the middle of the train in order to be able to ascend the grade just east of Montrose, called Haddocks, and up the Black Fork grade between Hendricks and Thomas. It occasionally picked up freight at Parsons from the Kingsford charcoal plant that was just west of Parsons. More on Parsons in a little bit. The local would proceed to Thomas, then the helpers would be removed from the middle of the train and put on the rear to shove to the top of the next grade at Fairfax, where the helper would cut off on the fly from the caboose. Cutting off on the fly is where the flagman on the caboose would turn the angle cock behind the caboose, disconnecting the air between the caboose and the helper locomotive. He would pull the lift pin, and the helper engineer would gradually reduce throttle and back away, and the helper locomotive would separate from the caboose. He would stop the helper locomotive, go to the other end, change ends, and head back toward Elkins. If there was a second train to be shoved, he would come back as far as Montrose, wait till the second train came out of Elkins, and then couple in and do the same process again all the way to Fairfax and come back toward Elkins. On the way back from Fairfax to Elkins, he would set off a locomotive at Parsons, and it would be used on a switcher that I'll talk about in a minute. One of the interesting things about going up the Black Fork grade was it was a very remote area, very sharp curves in a very highly wooded area where there were a lot of creatures roaming around the area, one of which would be rattlesnakes. One of the great pastimes that my grandfather had, who was on helpers quite a bit, he would watch for rattlesnakes going up the grade because they were only moving about 10 miles an hour. And it gave him a chance, he and his flagmen were on the helpers with him, to observe the rock ledges alongside the track to see if they could see rattlesnakes going up the grade. If they did happen to see one on the way back down, they would look for that spot and stop the helpers and kill that rattlesnake. He on one day, he had a rider with him from I'm not sure where, who observed this process of where they saw a rattlesnake going up the hill. He stopped on the way back and killed it. The man sent him a note and a picture of which are somewhere here to be shown, that shows my grandfather staring down at the flagman who is looking over the dead reptile. So the eastbound train, once the helper cut off at Fairfax, it would proceed on east toward Cumberland, Maryland, picking up loads of coal all the way down the line. And when the train ended up in Cumberland at a yard called Knobmount Yard in Cumberland, Maryland, which was the Western Maryland yard there, it would end up with maybe 100 or 120 loads of coal. If there was more coal than the local could take on a given day out of Elkins, a second train would be called the drag. It would be called to take coal to Cumberland as well, and generally it would take 16 hours to go from Elkins to Cumberland because it also picked up coal and wood chips along the way. I should mention that wood chips and pulpwood were one of the commodities that got hauled out of the Elkins area because of so much timbering done in that area. Wood chips and pulpwood all had to be put on the head end of a train. They could not ride behind coal in those trains going to Cumberland because the coal dust would get into the wood chips and on the pulpwood and ruin the paper that the pulpwood was being used to produce. So pulpwood and chips always had to be on the head end of the train. Talking about going from Elkins to Cumberland, if you worked 16 hours down and then came back another 16 hours the next day, that round trip would pay you just $100 for the entire round trip. So you worked 32 hours and made $100, but it was big money at that time. Another job in the Elkins area was called the Parsons Daily Belington Turn. This started out with a ride in the crew caller's personal automobile to the depot at Parsons, West Virginia. Excuse me. Upon arrival at the Parsons depot, the agent operator at the depot would give us a work order about what needed to be done, what switching needed to be done at the Kingsford plant and any other industries around the Parsons area. The locomotive that we would use for do this switching was a locomotive that the helper had set off. And we also had a caboose that was set off by the eastbound local. When he went through Parsons, on his way through, he would stop and pick up the loads of charcoal that had been set off from the previous day's Parsons Daily Belington switcher. He would pick up those loads and set off a caboose. So when we arrived in the caller's automobile, we had an engine and caboose there and just needed to go switch the plant with cars that had been set off on the west end of Parsons Passing siding to switch, put empties in and get the loads out of the charcoal plant. Working at charcoal plant was a pretty dirty job because they used pulverized coal and mixed with starch to make the charcoal. So the pulverized coal in a heavy wind or a high wind, the coal would get blown everywhere, especially up on the roofs and all over the plant. So if you were in the plant working and there was any wind at all, you could figure on having a pile of coal down your neck and all over your clothes because it would just fly everywhere. Once we'd switched the Parsons area in the Kingsford plant and set off the loads to be picked up by the next day's local, we came into Elkins with any empties that might need to move east, but had to go on the rear of a train on the next east local. When we arrived at Elkins, we cut away from the Parsons train and went and picked up a small cut of cars that were headed to the Daly branch. On the Daly branch, there were two sawmills, one at Beverly and one at Daly, that we would pick up wood chips from and occasionally a load of lumber. And we would set the empties out, going out and pick up the loads, coming back. We would come back into Elkins with maybe 4 or 5 loads of chips or lumber, cut off from that train and coupled to a train then that was destined for the Belington branch. These were generally coal cars that went down the Belington branch. There were 3 mines down the Belington branch, two of which worked almost every day, 5 days a week, that is, and a third one that worked very sporadically. So when we coupled to the Belington train, the caboose was next to the locomotive, and there was no caboose on the rear of the train. We just had the caboose and then however many coal cars we were going to place at the two mines generally that were down the Belington branch. The first mine you came to was the mine called Norton, and it was at Norton, West Virginia, and then Swamp Run mine, which was also in the vicinity of Norton, like a fourth of a mile away from the Norton mine. When we arrived at Swamp Run, we would take the caboose and put it against the loads that had been loaded at Swamp Run and shove those loads up to clear a track in the mine tipple, and cut away, set handbrakes on those loads, and then cut the locomotive off and put it in a side track there in the tipple. Once the locomotive was in the clear, we would release the handbrakes on the loads and they would roll free toward Belington. As soon as the loads cleared the locomotive, we would pull the locomotive out and couple to those loads that were rolling freely on their own. While that sounds kind of dangerous, there really wasn't any danger because the grade there was such that the loads wouldn't have gone very far before they reached a little grade that kept them, that would make them come back the other way. So we generally caught them before they ever started rolling back toward us. Once we had those Swamp Run loads in hand, we would go work the Norton mine and shove those loads back against Swamp Run loads and come back into Elkins. And if necessary, if we had to go on down to a mine called Gage, we would do that on the way west as well and come back and work Swamp Run on the way back instead of doing all that work at Swamp Run and Norton first. Occasionally, we would have to go to Belington to pick up a car that was interchanged from the B&O to the Western Maryland at Belington. Very interesting, this piece of track between Elkins and Belington, because they used to be parallel tracks, one owned by the Western Maryland, one owned by the B&O. At some point before I came to work on the railroad, the two railroads got their heads together and decided they really only needed one track between Belington and Elkins. So from Belington to Norton was the old Western Maryland track, and from Norton into Elkins was actually the B&O track that we operated over to bring the loads back from the Belington branch. So they were able to do away with about 18 miles of railroad, each railroad getting rid of about 9 miles of road in that process. Worked very well. The B&O only had one train a day that came out of Grafton to Elkins. They would spend the night and go back the next day, and business was pretty light there on that line, at least on the Belington end of it. When they went back east of Belington toward Grafton, they were able to pick up some cars and do some more business on their way back into Grafton. So the next job that was out of Elkins, or another job I should say, was the Durban turn. This job went out of Elkins toward Durban and carried interchange freight going to the C&O Railroad at Durban. The C&O Railroad operated a train out of Ronsford, West Virginia, a kind of a local train up their branch into Durban. The C&O crew would come into Durban and spend the night. And in the meantime, we on the Western Maryland side would bring our interchange cars over to Durban, set them in a side track at Durban, pick up any cars the C&O had brought in for us, and also pick up loads of pulpwood out of the wood yard there located on the Durban terminal. This job only had an engineer and a conductor and a flagman. There was no brakeman on this Durban turn, as that job had been negotiated away several years before I came to work on the railroad. One interesting situation I ran into as a flagman there, the flagman was responsible for the way bills. These were the bills that showed where each car that you were handling was going to go. You were to drop those bills in a bill box at Durban and then pick up the bills for the cars you were picking up to bring them back to Elkins. One particular night, my job was to put the way bills in a box and leave them for the C&O folks, and then get our way bills and come home. Well, I was fortunate enough to get our way bills for the cars that we were bringing back, but I failed to put the bills in the bill box for the C&O. Upon discovering my error, when I arrived back at Elkins, my wife and I made a quick trip to Durban in the car to take those way bills back so the C&O would have them the next day. Another job out of Elkins was a job that went to Laurel Bank called Slady Fork on the Western Maryland, and it went on down into Webster Springs, West Virginia. This job carried coal cars over to the Slady Fork area and wood chip cars as well. The Elkins crew, when they arrived at Slady Fork, turned the train over to a crew called the Laurel Bank Switcher Crew. This Laurel Bank Switcher Crew would take the cars on down the river to place at various mines at Hickory Lick, Burgoo, and Webster Springs, and work a lumber mill near Burgoo as well called Pardee and Curtin Lumber Company. When the Laurel Bank Switcher Crew would bring the train back to Laurel Bank, by that time, the crew that came out of Elkins had gotten rest at the Laurel Bank Rest House and had a meal there furnished by the folks that ran the boarding house there at Laurel Bank. So then the Elkins crew would get on the Laurel Bank Switcher train that they had brought in and take it back to Elkins. The grade out of Laurel Bank was very steep up to the top of the mountain, a place called Spruce, such that four 1,500 horsepower locomotives could only pull 28 loads of coal or chips up that grade. In later years, they would sometimes put a helper over there with that if business was, excuse me, if business was very good. The coal from that area was extremely good coal. It was good metallurgical coal, but it was just so expensive to get out of there. One last job out of Elkins was actually a job that was worked out of Bayard, West Virginia, but was manned by folks from Elkins. The job headquartered at Bayard, West Virginia, was the primary purpose of that job was to deliver coal to Virginia Electric Power Company's power plant at Stony River. Because the track was so steep in this area, the train always operated with a helper. It was not uncommon for this train to make 3 round trips a day to the power plant to deliver coal, sometimes 40 to 60 loads in each trip. There was a mine there just up the branch from Bayard called North Branch that was the primary source of the coal going to that power plant. This job paid a traveling switcher rate of pay, which was higher than the regular over-the-road pay, and it worked 16 hours most days and 7 days a week. It was often described as a mortgage lifter, meaning if you worked it long enough, you could pay off your entire mortgage. Because of this high pay, this job certainly went to the oldest people on the seniority roster. Being on the Brakeman's Extra Board, I was able to work all these jobs for the first 2 years of my career on the railroad. And while working all these jobs described above, in wintertime, business was down as most of the mines were strip mines. The mine roads were bad and the trucks couldn't get in and out of the mines to deliver the coal to coal tipples where it was loaded into coal cars. So the 3 other guys I hired with and I would get furloughed for weeks at a time. Railroad unemployment at the time paid $12.70 a day for 5 days a week. While that helped, it wasn't easy making ends meet. So in February of '72, I'd been furloughed for a few weeks, and the train master, Wes Utterback, called me and the next man behind me on the seniority roster to his office. Cumberland was having a surge of business and they needed brakemen. Mr. Utterback said they would provide lodging at the YMCA in Cumberland and give us $2 a day meal allowance if we would go there to work. Since there was no work in Elkins, this looked pretty attractive. So the other man and I went to Cumberland to work until work picked back up in Elkins. The other man that went to Cumberland with me went back to Elkins when the work there picked up. I decided to stay. The work ethic of the men that I worked with at the Elkins terminal was as good as any place on the many locations I would later work on CSX. And it was a strong influence on how I believe work needed to be done to get the job done. Working in Cumberland was certainly different from the Elkins work. Most of the work in Cumberland was moving freight between Cumberland and Bow West, Pennsylvania, or near Connellsville, Pennsylvania. It was easy work as you got on board the train and never got off until you reached Bow West. I couldn't believe the jobs were that easy, and it only took about 3 hours to go to Bow West and you'd made a day's pay, $24.25 at the time. After several months, we were told that we could go back to Elkins to work, but I again decided to stay because there was a lot more work there and I would never get furloughed again. I never drew another day's unemployment. In 1974, I was offered a chance to get trained as a locomotive engineer. I jumped at the chance because my grandfather had been an engineer, and it was what most brakemen and trainmen ascribed to do in many situations anyhow. The Western Maryland training program consisted of riding all the routes covered by the Cumberland Extra Board, Engineers Extra Board, while being trained by already promoted engineers. There was no formal schooling involved in this training at all. The jobs out of Cumberland were Cumberland to Elkins, which was the reverse of the Elkins to Cumberland turn, Cumberland to Bow West, over the B&O route called the Sheepskin, Bow West to Fairmont, which was the B&O, which was the B&O route, and Western Maryland had trackage rights over it. A turn called the Gray Turn, which was an empty coal movement from Cumberland to a mine called Federoff Mine, and return with loads over the B&O from Rockwood, Pennsylvania to Somerset. We had trackage rights over the B&O there as well. The job called the CMP job, which worked brick plants in the Frostburg, Maryland area. A Luke Switcher, which is where all the wood chips came from Elkins and the pulpwood, which worked the West Vaco paper mill at Luke, Maryland. There was a job called the Georges Creek job, which worked from Cumberland up the Georges Creek branch near Westernport to the end of the line at a mine called Console number 10. We would place empties going up and bring the loads coming back on the Georges Creek branch and bring them back into Cumberland. After learning all these jobs, I was promoted to locomotive engineer on October 27, 1974, 50 years and 2 days after my grandfather had been hired as a fireman. I worked the next 2 years as an engineer and loved it very much. In 1976, I was offered an assistant road foreman's position, supervising locomotive engineers at Cowan, West Virginia. My wife and I discussed it and decided to give it a try. So on November 1st, 1976, I was given that appointment. My first assignment on that first day was to pilot the first coal trains to be operated over the new grade between Shaw, West Virginia and Bloomington, Maryland on that line from Elkins to Cumberland. They had built a new dam at Bloomington, and the Western Maryland track had to be rerouted around the dam, and there were no engineers qualified on that territory. So my first assignment was to help pilot those trains, the East locals coming across that particular piece of track, that new piece of track that had been installed. Once that job was done, then it was off to Cowan. I reported to Cowan and met Trainmaster Harold Beto Carpenter. He taught me so much about managing a territory and was a great mentor and a wonderful man who not only told me or taught me about railroading, but about life as well. In August of 1977, just 9 short months after arriving in Cowan, I was offered a job and accepted a teaching job in teaching engineer trainees at the Cumberland Engineers Training School. I struggled with teaching as I didn't get any satisfaction from training the young to be engineers like I did when I dropped a train off a mountain successfully and didn't have any accidents or any injuries. I just couldn't see or get the job satisfaction that most people want out of a job when they're doing a job. They want some type of satisfaction, I believe. One day I was teaching a class and I had a trainee that just couldn't grasp the concept that I was trying to teach. So I thought, well, I'm going to try another way of explaining this process. And all of a sudden you could just see it was like lights lit up in his eyes. And I knew that he understood what I was trying to explain. There was the job satisfaction that I'd been looking for. So it was very rewarding from then on once I found that satisfaction in that job. After teaching for a while and learning a whole lot while you're teaching, I was anxious to put all my newfound knowledge to work. I was offered a road foreman of engines position in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania in February 1979, and I accepted that offer. I enjoyed teaching the engineers under my supervision the reason things had to be done a certain way to comply with the operating and train handling rules. It wasn't always easy trying to teach a 40-year-old veteran engineer a better way to do something when you're only a 27-year-old kid, but we made it through it just fine. In February of 1981, I accepted the position of Assistant Superintendent of Locomotive Operation. This was a transportation department job, but the office was located in a mechanical facility in Cumberland, Maryland, in a locomotive shop complex. This job and an identical job located in Huntington, the OH building for the C&O, were meant to be a liaison jobs between mechanical and transportation to work on any issues between the two departments and try and get the best quality locomotives that we could pulling our trains. Jack Roberts was the man that had the C&O job. We reported to a gentleman named Harry Eck in Baltimore, who was one of the most knowledgeable men I ever worked with. He had started working as a fireman on the B&O and the steam engineer and had progressed into management just as diesels were coming on the scene. This job involved doing locomotive testing on newer or redesigned locomotives, working with the road foreman on train handling, fuel conservation issues, and exploring new train size potential. In the summer of '83, we instituted the Big Mac coal trains, which were 190-car coal trains named after our general manager, Arch McElvaney, whose idea it was to run these bigger trains between Russell, Kentucky and Newport News, Virginia. The train size up to that point in time had only been 125 cars. So going from 125 to 190 cars was a big jump in productivity, but it required a helper locomotive to be on the rear from Hinton to East Allegheny. But we saved a lot of locomotives in that process of hauling the bigger trains with fewer locomotives. The major obstacle, of course, in that route was across the Allegheny subdivision between Hinton and Clifton Forge, Virginia, up past the Greenbrier on that line. During this time, my time on this job, we also tested and implemented end of train devices that would allow for the elimination of the caboose. We also developed with Pulse Electronics Company a device that would permit helper locomotive to be cut off while the train was still moving. Because there were no cabooses then, since we developed the EOT, we had no cabooses, so we had nobody on the rear to cut the helpers away. So we developed a device with Pulse that would allow us to do that without a man being on the rear other than the helper locomotive engineer. He was the one that was able to institute the cutoff procedure, and it's worked very, very well and still in place today. One of the jobs that Jack Roberts and I were tasked to do was a locomotive study at Cincinnati's Queensgate Yard. Because of my knowledge of slugs used on the Western Maryland hump, I recommended we try to use one on the Queensgate hump. A slug is a locomotive that has no engine in it. It only has traction motors and weight, and it gets its electrical power from a mother locomotive that's attached to it. So you end up saving a powered locomotive by use of this slug, which are very economical to build, and there's virtually no maintenance to them. So we tried the slug on Queensgate hump, and sure enough, it worked like a champ. So that then became the standard for CSX humps across the entire network. We instituted them everywhere we could. Harriak retired in September of 1985, and I was awarded his position as superintendent of locomotive operation headquartered in Baltimore. It was a struggle for my wife and two children aged 14 and 10 at the time, as they developed strong friendships in school and at home. They didn't want to move at all. I felt like I had to take the job, as that seemed like what I'd always been trained to do my entire career. It wasn't easy for them, but we decided to go. We'd always been small town folks living all over West Virginia, and Baltimore was quite a culture shock for all of us, I've got to admit. The job had the responsibility for managing the train handling instructions for the entire chassis system, and was the #1 position in the road foreman of engines organization at that time. Fortunately for us, the Baltimore job was transferred to Jacksonville, Florida in June of 1985. And as a result of the Chassis Seaboard merger called CSX, I ended up with the #2 position in the road foreman's organization, working for a gentleman named Paul Stringfellow, who was a longtime veteran of the L&N Railroad and the merged Seaboard system. It made sense for Paul to have that lead job since he had so much more experience than I did managing an entire group of road foremen. Paul retired in 1991, so I moved up to the top job again in the road foreman's group. In 1992, we developed the engineer certification program for CSX that was required by the FRA. We did the training in both Cumberland and Atlanta, Georgia. I also inherited the job of managing the tonnage ratings for the entire CSX network. These ratings gave our managers the knowledge of how much a locomotive could pull over a given territory. In 2005, after the Conrail acquisition, I moved into the locomotive management department and became the general manager of locomotive planning. While in this job, I worked with General Motors and General Electric to give them insight into how we needed our locomotives to perform, and taking the knowledge from Western Maryland again, we had a couple of locomotives that were heavier than the rest of the 6-axle locomotives in the Western Maryland fleet. And these locomotives performed very, very well. At the time, I went into this locomotive planning job. We were having trouble with AC, that's AC traction motor locomotives, which were new to the industry. we were having problems with those locomotives powering trains from Grafton to Cumberland. The trains would get up against the grade and stall, and especially in inclement weather. So based on the knowledge of the Western Maryland heavy locomotives, I suggested to my boss that we ask GE and EMD, or General Motors at the time, to build us a couple of heavy locomotives, heavier than normal. At that time, the normal locomotives were anywhere between 408, 412,000 pounds. I suggested we go up to 432,000 pounds for these new heavy locomotives. GE agreed to do it, EMD did not. So we took the two GE locomotives that they had built for us and took them to Roseburg, West Virginia, where we had a helper operation that helped assist those trains out of Grafton toward Cumberland. Those locomotives performed marvelously well, and train stalls immediately started dropping down to where we had virtually no train stalls with these heavy locomotives powering the trains. Well, of course, we only had two of those locomotives at the time, but we worked with GE to get through the process of making sure that we weren't going to break something on the locomotives by keeping the locomotives in Roseburg for about a year to make sure that everything worked well on them. After that, GE agreed that, yeah, they would go ahead and build 432,000 pounds as our normal locomotive. That weight locomotive is now caught on in the industry, and probably most of the industry is now ordering 432,000 pound AC locomotives. In November of 2006, in a Train magazine article, an attorney friend of mine, Jay Potter, wrote an article describing this testing that was done to prove the concept of adding weight to a locomotive. It's a very good article. He did a very nice job with it. In December of 2011, I retired from CSX after 41 and a half years of working for this great company and the many great supervisors. I'm grateful to have worked for this company where I enjoyed many rewarding opportunities. After I retired, I did consulting work for one of the locomotive builders and a private consulting firm that took me around the USA to Jamaica, Colombia, South America, and Canada. And I was only able to do this with the help of a supportive wife and great kids and quite a bit of divine intervention. I want to thank the West Virginia Railroad Museum for this opportunity to share my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.